He didn't know it yet, but the boy in the worn-out
What are
shoes was about to
those?
teach
Where
an
did you
entire
even get
town
them?
what it means to underestimate someone quietly waiting his turn. And by the time the phone rang in that gymnasium, nobody in Cedar Falls would ever look at a pair of sneakers the same way again. Before we get into this one, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If you've been here before, you know these stories only get crazier. So hit subscribe now, because the next one queued up after this might be the wildest reversal we've ever told. Okay, let's get into it. Cedar Falls, Ohio, sits about 40 minutes outside Columbus, the kind of town where the water tower still gets painted before homecoming, where the high school football scores run above the fold in the local paper, and where everybody has an opinion about everybody else's business, whether they're asked for it or not. Cedar Falls Middle School anchors the east side of town, a squat brick building from the 70s, with a gym addition bolted on in the 90s, fluorescent lights buzzing over hallways that smell like floor wax and pizza day. It's not a bad school. It's not a rich school, either, except for the small, loud slice of it that acts like it is. That slice includes Tyler Briggs. Tyler is 13, built like he already knows he's going to be the starting point guard next year, and he moves through the halls like he owns the deed to them. His father sits on the Cedar Falls School Board, vice chair, to be specific, a title Tyler brings up more than anyone asked him to. Tyler's not stupid. He's actually sharp when he wants to be, which is part of what makes him dangerous, in the particular way middle schoolers can be dangerous. He knows exactly which jokes will land with an audience, and exactly which kid won't fight back. He's never really been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected, and somewhere in that gap, something in him curdled, quietly, the way it does with kids who mistake fear for admiration. Marcus Webb showed up 3 weeks ago. He's 13 too, quiet in the specific way of someone who's learned that quiet is safer than the alternative. He'd moved through 4 placements in 2 years before landing with Daniel and Renee Whitfield. And if you asked Marcus about any of that, he'd change the subject so smoothly you might not even notice he'd done it. He watches more than he talks. When teachers call on him, he answers precisely and sits back down. He's not unfriendly. He just hasn't decided yet who's safe to let in, and nobody in Cedar Falls has done much to convince him it's worth the risk. He wears the same pair of shoes every day. Gray, once white mesh, the kind with a sole starting to separate at the left toe, a small tear along the seam that he's covered with a strip of black tape, neat as a suture. They were his in his last placement. The one good thing that was actually his, that nobody took back when things fell apart. He could have new shoes tomorrow. He knows that. He's chosen, so far, not to ask. Nobody at Cedar Falls Middle School knows that Marcus's foster parents are Daniel and Renee Whitfield. The Whitfields, as in Foothold Athletics, the sneaker company that started in a garage 2 towns over and now sits on the feet of half the pro athletes plastered across the posters in the boys' locker room. Marcus has never mentioned it. Not to a teacher, not to a classmate, not even really to himself out loud. It isn't a secret so much as a boundary. He's not ready to be the foster kid with the rich family, before he's had the chance to just be Marcus to somebody, anybody, first. Coach Elena Reyes has taught PE and assistant coach basketball at Cedar Falls for 11 years, long enough to have learned the particular arithmetic of a middle school cafeteria. Who sits where, who laughs on cue, who's absorbing something they'll never report. She'd clocked Marcus's shoes the first week, not because they were remarkable, but because of the tape job. Careful, deliberate, the kind of care that told her more about the kid than any file ever would. She hadn't said anything. Some things you don't fix by pointing at them. It's a Tuesday, second lunch period. The cafeteria doing its usual controlled roar, trays clattering, somebody's speaker leaking tinny music from a back pocket. The particular chaos of 213-year-olds pretending they aren't all watching each other. Marcus sits near the end of a table by the windows, the seat he's claimed without anyone contesting it, working through a sandwich he brought from home in a paper bag folded at the top with the same neatness as that tape on his shoe. Tyler's table is louder, closer to the center of the room, the kind of real estate that gets claimed through sheer volume rather than any actual permission. He's mid-story about a travel basketball tournament, the kind of story that's really just an excuse to mention the hotel had a pool, when his eyes drift, the way they do, scanning the room for the next thing to land a joke on. They land on Marcus's shoes. Yo, Tyler's voice does the thing it does, pitches up just enough to pull attention from 2 tables over, without looking like that's what he's doing. Webb. Bro. What year are those from? A couple of kids at his table laugh before they even know what they're laughing at, which is its own kind of skill Tyler's built over the years, cueing the laugh before the punchline arrives. So the joke feels bigger than it is by the time it lands. Marcus doesn't look up right away. He finishes chewing, sets the sandwich down, and only then meets Tyler's eyes. Not sharp, not scared, just level. The way you'd look at whether you'd already checked the forecast for. They're comfortable, Marcus says. It's such a plain answer that for half a second it almost kills the moment. But Tyler's not done, because Tyler's never done with the first line. The first line is just the setup. Comfortable. Tyler repeats it like it's the funniest word he's ever heard, glancing around to make sure his table's still with him. My guy's got tape on his shoe like he's trying to keep the soul from filing a missing persons report. That gets a Real laugh this time, louder, spreading 2 seats further than it should. Marcus's jaw tightens, just barely, the only visible sign that the words landed anywhere at all. He doesn't answer. He picks the sandwich back up. Coach Reyes, 3 tables over on cafeteria duty, doesn't hear the exact words, but she hears the shape of the laugh, the specific pitch that means somebody just got made an example of. She looks over in time to see Marcus's face doing absolutely nothing, which, to someone who spent 11 years reading 13-year-olds, is somehow louder than if he'd cried. She starts walking over. Not fast. Not obvious. Just close enough that the next comment, if there is one, will have a witness it wasn't expecting. Tyler sees her coming and pulls back, instantly recalibrating, the practiced innocence sliding onto his face like he'd never stopped smiling about the weather. "We're just talking, Coach," he says, easy, confident, already 3 moves ahead of any consequence he can imagine. Coach Reyes doesn't answer him. She looks at Marcus instead. "You good?" "I'm good," Marcus says. And in the moment, watching him say it, steady, unbothered, giving nothing away, you'd almost believe there was nothing underneath it at all. But this was only lunch. This was only the first laugh. Cedar Falls Middle School had no idea what it had just started. Word got around fast, the way it does in a building where 200 kids share 4 lunch tables worth of real social territory. By Wednesday morning, Webb's shoe had already become shorthand. Not quite a nickname, not yet, but close enough that Marcus caught 2 kids he didn't know snickering when he walked past the trophy case outside the gym. He didn't ask what was funny. He'd learned a long time ago that asking just handed people a second chance to say it to your face. Tyler, for his part, had spent the previous evening feeling unusually pleased with himself. His group chat had 3 separate messages replaying his missing persons report line, one of them with a laughing emoji chain long enough to require scrolling. His father had asked at dinner how school was going, and Tyler had said fine, which was true in the sense that things were going exactly the way Tyler liked them, which is to say, exactly the way Tyler had arranged them. Thursday PE class. Coach Reyes ran a mixed unit that fall, half the period on conditioning drills, half on pickup games, rotating kids through to keep things fair, or at least fair on paper. Marcus generally hovered in the middle of the pack during drills, not the fastest, not the slowest, doing what was asked without drawing a single extra second of attention his way. It had worked for 3 weeks. It stopped working the moment the class transitioned into stretching circle, and Tyler, warming up 2 spots down, glanced over at Marcus's shoes again, like he was checking to see if the joke had gotten funnier overnight. "You still rocking the museum piece?" Tyler said, loud enough for the row to hear, not really a question. A kid named Jordan, who mostly followed Tyler's lead because it was easier than not following it, snorted. "Bro's shoe got more mileage than my dad's truck." More laughs. Not the whole class. Plenty of kids just kept stretching, eyes down, the universal middle school skill of pretending not to notice things you'd rather not get pulled into. But enough laughed that the sound carried, and carrying sound is really all Tyler had ever wanted from any of this. Marcus kept his eyes on his own knees, breathing through the stretch, saying nothing. It wasn't performance. He genuinely didn't have anything he wanted to say to Tyler Briggs, not because he was too scared to, but because some part of him understood, with a clarity most 13-year-olds don't have, that Tyler wasn't actually talking about shoes. Tyler was talking about worth. And Marcus had already decided a long time ago, somewhere between his second placement and his third, that he wasn't going to let some kid's opinion about a shoelace decide what he was worth. Still, it landed. It always lands, even when you've built the walls high enough that nobody can see it land. Coach Reyes blew her whistle to break up the stretch circle and start drills. And as she walked the line checking form, she paused near Marcus a beat longer than necessary. "Ankle giving you trouble?" she asked, nodding at nothing in particular, giving him an easy out if he wanted one. "No, ma'am. I'm good." "All right." She moved on. But she'd clocked Tyler's little audience-building routine too, filed it next to what she'd seen Tuesday, and started doing the quiet math teachers do. Not enough yet to write up, not nothing either. The kind of pattern you watch, because you know from experience that these things don't stay small on their own. They only get talked out of growing. By Friday, the joke had picked up a second layer, the way jokes do when a group needs to feel clever for repeating one. Somebody, not even Tyler this time, just one of the kids orbiting him, asked Marcus in the hallway if his shoes came with a warranty or a eulogy. Marcus didn't answer that one either. He just adjusted the strap on his backpack and kept walking, the tape on his shoe flexing slightly with each step, a small dark line against gray mesh that had started to mean something different to him than it used to. It used to just be a shoe he liked. Now it was starting to feel like the one thing he refused to let anybody talk him out of. That weekend at the Whitfield house, Renee noticed him staring a little too long at the shoe rack by the back door. 3 pairs of brand-new foothold trainers still in their boxes, sitting there since the week he moved in. An offer nobody had pushed on him. "You know those are yours whenever you want them," she said, not looking up from the dishes, keeping her voice light on purpose. "No pressure. Just saying." "I know," Marcus said. "I like the ones I have." Renee glanced at him, then really looked, the way she'd learned to look at foster kids over 4 placements of her own with Daniel, learning which comments needed following up and which needed to be let go entirely. Something in the set of his shoulders told her this wasn't really about the shoes. But she also knew better than to chase that thread before he was ready to hand it to her. "Okay," she said simply. "Whenever." Marcus almost told her then. Almost said something about a kid at school, about a joke that had followed him from Tuesday through Friday like gum on a shoe. He got as far as opening his mouth. Then he thought about what would happen if he said it, how it would turn into a conversation, how the conversation would turn into someone calling the school, how calling the school would turn into everyone finding out exactly who the Whitfields were and exactly why that mattered, and how none of that would happen on his terms. It would happen because he'd been embarrassed into it. So he closed his mouth and said, "I'm going to go finish my homework," and went upstairs, and did not finish his homework so much as sit on the edge of his bed for 20 minutes, running his thumb along the strip of tape on his shoe like it was a rosary. Monday brought a new week, and, with it, Tyler's appetite for an audience that hadn't fully cashed out yet. He'd noticed everyone had, really, that Marcus never fired back. Never got red in the face, never stammered. Never gave Tyler the one thing every bully secretly wants more than laughter. Proof that the joke actually worked. That absence of reaction should have been a warning sign. To a kid like Tyler, it read instead as an invitation. If the first 2 jokes hadn't cracked him, the thinking went, unspoken and half-formed but very real. Then the next one just needed to be bigger. He didn't have a specific plan yet. He just knew, the way certain kids always know, that the gym was where things escalated. The cafeteria was for jokes you could walk away from. The gym was for jokes you couldn't. Coach Reyes didn't know that yet either. But she started keeping a small note in her phone. Dates, nothing more, 3 of them so far, next to Marcus's name. The kind of quiet paper trail teachers learn to build long before anyone asks them to justify it. She had a feeling she'd need it soon. Wednesday's pickup game started the way it always did. Coach Reyes splitting the class into 2 loose squads for the last 20 minutes a period. Less a formal drill than a controlled release valve for 13-year-olds who'd been sitting in desks all morning. Tyler was team captain by unspoken consensus, the way he was captain of most things by unspoken consensus. He picked his squad fast, confident, calling names like he was reading off a leaderboard only he could see. Marcus ended up on the other team. which put him directly across from Tyler for most of the game. Not by design exactly, just the geometry of a 5-on-5 running full court in a space built for 4-on-4. Marcus played the way he did everything else, efficient, unshowy, boxing out under the rim, feeding the ball to whoever had the better angle instead of forcing his own shot. He wasn't flashy. He was solid. Solid doesn't get you noticed in a gym full of 13-year-olds who all think they're one good game away from varsity. It might have stayed that way, a quiet, forgettable Wednesday, except that 6 minutes in, Marcus stole a pass Tyler had thrown a little too casually and took it the length of the court for an easy layup. The gym did what gyms do. A handful of kids on Marcus's team hooped. Somebody clapped. It was nothing, really, a decent play in a pickup game that would be forgotten by lunch, except that Tyler didn't take it as nothing. Tyler took it as the room laughing at him instead of with him, and Tyler had never once in his life sat comfortably with that feeling. He didn't say anything right away. That was almost worse in hindsight. The delay, the visible churn of him deciding how to get the room back. Next possession, Tyler brought the ball up himself. And when Marcus stepped in to guard him, Tyler slowed down, dribbling at half speed, performing for an audience that hadn't asked for a show. "Watch him try to keep up in them shoes," Tyler said, loud, grinning at his own teammates like he'd set up the funniest bit of the year. Man's out here playing defense in orthopedic sneakers. Some laughs. Not as many as he wanted. Marcus stayed in his stance, weight low, eyes on Tyler's, hips the way Coach Reyes had taught them, refusing to give the joke anywhere to land besides the open air it was thrown into. That refusal seemed to make Tyler angrier than the joke itself would have. He drove hard right and Marcus stayed in front of him, clean, legal, good defense, until Tyler, instead of pulling up for the shot he had space for, extended his elbow at the last second and caught Marcus across the jaw hard enough to snap his head sideways. The whistle screamed almost the exact same second Marcus's sneaker, the taped one, skidded on the hardwood, and he went down, hard, palms first, the squeak of the fall echoing off the bleachers. For 1 full second, the gym went dead silent. Then Tyler, breathing hard, ball still in his hands, said the line that would end up quoted back to him for the rest of the year. "My bad. Didn't realize the tape made him that slow." A few kids laughed, nervously this time, the kind of laugh that comes out before anyone's decided whether it's actually funny, because laughing felt safer than the silence that came before it. Coach Reyes's whistle was already at full volume, cutting through it. "Briggs, sit. Now." Tyler opened his mouth. It was an accident, Coach, ask anybody. But she was already moving, and something in the set of her jaw made even Tyler decide, for once, that this particular hill wasn't worth dying on mid-sentence. She crouched next to Marcus, who was already pushing himself up onto one knee, jaw tight, testing the heel of his hand where he'd caught his fall. "You okay?" "Look at me." "Marcus." "I'm fine." His voice had a slight edge now, the first one anybody had heard all week. Not loud, not shaking, just tighter than before, like a rope pulled one notch closer to its limit. "You're not fine. You went down hard." "Nurse." "Now." She helped him to his feet, one hand under his arm, and looked back at the rest of the class, who were standing in that particular frozen half-circle kids form when they're watching something they know they'll be asked about later. "Everybody else, sit on the line. Nobody's touching a ball for the rest of this period." Tyler, sitting on the bleachers where he'd been ordered, tried the same easy grin one more time, testing whether it would still work on her the way it worked on everyone else. "Coach, seriously, it was just a game," he tripped. "I watched you extend that elbow, Tyler." Her voice was flat, final, the kind of tone that ends conversations instead of starting them. "We'll talk about it in the office. Right now, sit there and don't say another word." He sat. For the first time all week, Tyler Briggs didn't have anything clever to add. The walk to the nurse's office took maybe 90 seconds, Marcus favoring his right hand slightly, Coach Reyes matching his pace instead of rushing him. Neither of them said much until they were almost there. "That elbow wasn't an accident," she said finally, quiet, not really a question. Marcus looked straight ahead. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me." She stopped walking, just for a second, and he stopped with her. And she looked at him with the kind of directness most adults never bothered aiming at a foster kid 3 weeks into a new placement. "I've seen what's been happening since Tuesday. The shoe stuff. I should have stepped in sooner. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of someone realizing they hadn't been as invisible as they'd assumed. It's fine. I don't need it to be a whole thing. It's already a whole thing, Coach Reyes said, gently but without backing down. The only question left is whether it gets handled like one. Marcus didn't answer that. He just flexed his hand, wincing slightly, and kept walking toward the nurse's office, the torn seam on his left shoe flexing with each step. Tape holding, same as it always had. Behind them, back in the gym, Tyler sat alone on the bleachers, replaying his own line in his head. Didn't realize the tape made him that slow, and for reasons he couldn't quite name yet, it didn't feel as good the second time around. He had no idea it was about to feel a lot worse. Because that afternoon, sitting in her office, filling out an incident report she should have started 3 days earlier, Coach Reyes's phone was going to ring. And the name on the screen was about to change everything Cedar Falls Middle School thought it knew about the kid in the old shoes. The nurse's office smelled like hand sanitizer and the particular quiet of a room built for waiting. Marcus sat on the edge of the exam table while the school nurse, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Alvarez, checked the scrape on his palm and pressed gently along his jaw, where Tyler's elbow had caught him. "Nothing broken," she said. "Might bruise a little. You want ice?" "I'm okay," Marcus said, which was becoming something close to his answer for everything. Coach Reyes stood by the door, arms crossed, not because she didn't trust Ms. Alvarez to do her job, but because she wasn't ready to leave Marcus alone yet, not with the incident report still open on her clipboard, not with the image of that elbow still fresh in her mind. She'd seen a lot of accidental contact in 11 years of PE class. That hadn't been one of them. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was mid-sentence writing unsafe contact, unprovoked in the report, but the screen showed a number she recognized from the emergency contact sheet she'd pulled that morning after deciding, finally, that this needed to go further than a note in her own private file. R. Whitfield. She stepped half out into the hallway, keeping Marcus in view through the open door. "This is Coach Reyes." "Hi, Coach Reyes. This is Renee Whitfield, Marcus's foster mom." The voice on the other end was warm but businesslike, the tone of someone used to juggling a dozen things at once and handling all of them the same steady way. "I'm so sorry to call out of nowhere. I know it's the middle of a school day. Marcus has a specialist appointment this afternoon we've had booked for weeks. It's for a hearing screening, nothing urgent, but the slot's tight. I was hoping I could pick him up a little early, around 1:15? I should have called the front office directly. His number for the office was still updated to his old placement. So they redirected me to you since you had him for PE. Coach Reyes glanced back through the door at Marcus. Sitting there with an ice pack, Ms. Alvarez had talked him into holding against his jaw after all, staring at the floor tiles like they owed him an explanation. "That's actually good timing, honestly," Coach Reyes said carefully. "There was an incident in PE today. Marcus is okay, but I want to loop you in before you get here, if that's all right." There was a small pause on the line, the kind that told her Renee Whitfield was the sort of person who went quiet before she got upset, not after. "What kind of incident?" "Another student caught him with an elbow during a pickup game. I don't believe it was accidental. There's also been some verbal stuff this week, comments about his shoes, mostly, that I should have addressed sooner than I did. I'm filing an incident report right now." Another pause, shorter this time. "I appreciate you telling me directly. I'll be there at 1:15. I'd like to speak with the principal while I'm there, if that's possible. I'll let the front office know to expect you. Thank you, Coach Reyes." A beat. And thank you for calling it what it was. A lot of people wouldn't have. The call ended. Coach Reyes stood in the hallway a second longer than she needed to, turning something over in her head, not the content of the call exactly, but a small detail that had snagged on the way past. Whitfield, it wasn't an uncommon name, but something about the calm, exact way the woman had spoken, like someone used to handling a crisis by making it smaller, not louder, stuck with her. She went back inside. "Your ride's coming a little early today," she told Marcus. "Renee called. Said you've got an appointment." Marcus looked up, surprised in a way that had nothing to do with the appointment and everything to do with the fact that his foster mother had apparently just talked to his PE teacher about the last 4 days without him having said a single word to anyone. She's coming now. 1:15. I told her about today. Coach Reyes watched his face carefully. I hope that's okay. Marcus didn't answer right away. Something in him, the part that had spent 3 weeks keeping 2 entirely separate lives in 2 entirely separate boxes, understood, with a small internal lurch, that the boxes were about to touch. By the time 1:15 rolled around, the gym class incident had already done its usual underground lap through the school's social bloodstream. Not the full story, just fragments, the way these things travel. Asterisk Briggs elbowed some kid. Coach Reyes went off on him. Somebody's getting suspended, probably. Asterisk a cluster of 8th graders lingered near the front hallway between classes, half on their way to 5th period, half just killing time, when a woman walked through the front doors and up to the reception window. She was maybe mid-40s, dressed simply but with a kind of quiet precision that reads as put together without trying, a fitted jacket, dark jeans, and shoes that a couple of the more sneaker-literate kids in that hallway clocked immediately, because they were unmistakable. Black and silver low tops with the distinctive stitched arrow along the side panel that every serious sneakerhead in America would recognize on sight. Foothold Athletics. The same logo half the boys in that hallway had on their own shoes, their backpacks, a poster taped inside somebody's locker. "Hi, I'm here to pick up Marcus Webb," the woman said to the front desk attendant. "I'm Renee Whitfield, his foster mother." One of the kids in the hallway cluster, a boy named Devin, who happened to own 3 separate pairs of Foothold trainers and had strong, frequently shared opinions about all of them, did a small double take. "Wait," Devin said, mostly to himself, mostly too loud. "Whitfield. Like Foothold Whitfield." It should have stayed a stray comment lost in hallway noise. But Tyler Briggs was in that cluster too, sitting on the bench outside the principal's office where he'd been sent to wait, separately at a distance, but well within earshot. And something about the word foothold cut clean through whatever sulking he'd been doing about his own impending consequences. "No way," Tyler said, not quite believing it, already laughing a little at the idea. That's a coincidence. There's no way that's actually." He didn't get to finish, because at that exact moment the front office door opened and the principal, Mr. Kowalski, stepped out to greet the visitor personally, which almost never happened for a regular pickup, and said, with the particular warmth reserved for people whose names carry weight in a small town, "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you so much for coming in. I know this wasn't the afternoon you planned." "Please call me Renee," she said, and then her eyes found Marcus, who'd come down the hallway from the nurse's office with Ms. Alvarez trailing a step behind, ice pack still pressed to his jaw. Something in Renee's expression softened instantly, the professional composure giving way, just for a second, to something unmistakably parental. "Hey, you," she said, crossing to him. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus said, for what felt like the 100th time that week. But this time his voice wobbled slightly on the second word, just barely, just enough that anyone truly listening would have caught it. Renee didn't make a scene. She just put a hand lightly on his shoulder, steady, grounding, and turned back to Mr. Kowalski. "I'd still like a few minutes, if you have them." "Of course. My office." Mr. Kowalski glanced past her, and his eyes landed on Tyler, sitting alone on the bench, face gone several shades paler than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "Tyler, I'll need you and your father in here as well, once he arrives." Tyler didn't say anything. For possibly the first time in his entire middle school career, Tyler Briggs had absolutely nothing to say. Down the hallway, Devin was already pulling out his phone, texting furiously. The words "Dude Webb's foster mom owns Foothold" traveling through group chats faster than any joke about a taped-up sneaker ever had. Marcus watched it happen. Watched the exact moment his 2 separate lives stopped being separate. Watched a hallway full of kids rearrange everything they thought they understood about him in real time, and felt something complicated settle in his chest. Not triumph, exactly. Something closer to exhaustion, mixed with a strange, unfamiliar relief that the box hadn't broken open because he bragged. It had broken open because it was simply, finally, true. Renee's hand was still steady on his shoulder as they walked toward the principal's office, Tyler falling into step several feet behind them, quieter than anyone at Cedar Falls Middle School had ever seen him. The reveal hadn't come with fanfare. No dramatic announcement, no triumphant unveiling. Just a phone call about a hearing appointment, a name on a badge nobody expected to see walk through those doors, and a taped-up shoe that had never needed defending in the first place. Mr. Kowalski's office had the particular hush of a room built for delivering bad news gently. Diplomas on the wall, a small potted plant that had clearly survived on second-hand water for years, and a round table instead of a desk, meant to soften whatever conversation happened across it. Renee sat on one side with Marcus beside her, still holding the ice pack he'd forgotten he was holding. Coach Reyes sat near the window, incident report in hand. Mr. Kowalski took the third chair, and for a moment nobody said anything at all, waiting for the fourth chair to fill. It filled 15 minutes later, when Tyler's father arrived. Gerald Briggs came the way he did most things, fast, sure of himself, already talking before he'd fully sat down. "Gerald Briggs, I'm Tyler's father. I got here as soon as I could." He extended a hand toward Mr. Kowalski, then toward Renee, before actually looking at her. "Gerald Briggs. I'm on the school board, vice chair, so if there's anything procedural I can help smooth over here." "Renee Whitfield," she said, shaking his hand once evenly. "Marcus's foster mother." Something flickered across Gerald's face. The particular recalibration of a man doing quick math on a name he half recognized but couldn't yet place. He sat down without finishing the thought out loud. Mr. Kowalski opened the folder in front of him. "I want to walk through what we know so far. Coach Reyes, would you summarize the incident?" She did, plainly, without editorializing, laying out the elbow, the fall, the comment that followed it, and then, because it mattered, the pattern that had preceded it. The cafeteria on Tuesday, the stretching circle on Thursday, the hallway comment on Friday. "This wasn't an isolated incident," she said. "It was the fourth I'm aware of in a week, and I take responsibility for not escalating it after the first one." Gerald leaned forward, already assembling his defense before the facts had fully landed. "Now, boys rib each other. I'm not saying it's ideal, but pickup basketball gets physical, elbows happen." "I watched him extend it," Coach Reyes said, flat, not unkind, but immovable. "It wasn't incidental contact. And the comment that followed wasn't an accident either." "What comment?" Gerald asked, and there was something almost genuine in the question, the sound of a man who truly hadn't imagined his son capable of the specific thing he was about to hear. Mr. Kowalski read it from a report, quoting Tyler directly, that didn't realize the tape made him that slow line landing in the room with a weight it hadn't carried in the gym, stripped now of the nervous laughter that had cushioned it the first time. Gerald's jaw tightened. He looked at Tyler, who'd said almost nothing since walking in, sitting slightly apart from the table like he was hoping to be forgotten. "Tyler, is that true?" "It was a joke," Tyler said, quieter than his usual register. The bravado from the hallway gone entirely now that his father's expression had shifted from confusion to something colder. "Everybody was laughing." "Everybody was laughing," Renee repeated, not sharply, just enough to let the sentence sit there and show itself for what it was. "At a kid wearing shoes he can't afford to replace, in your understanding. That was the joke." Gerald opened his mouth to soften it. Some version of boys will be boys was visibly loading, and then stopped because something in Renee's tone, calm and utterly unhurried, made clear that whatever he said next was going to be measured very carefully against what actually mattered here, not what was comfortable. "I want to be direct about something," Renee said, turning to address the table generally, not performing, just stating fact. "Marcus's shoes aren't a hardship. He has 3 new pairs sitting in a box at home he hasn't wanted to wear yet, for his own reasons, which are his business. What happened this week wasn't about whether he can afford shoes. It was about a group of students deciding a quiet kid was safe to target, and an adult in the room not stepping in soon enough to stop it before it became this." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room had already gone very still around her. "I run a company," she continued evenly, "that makes the exact shoes half the school is wearing right now. I'm not telling you that to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you because I want to be clear that this was never about scarcity. It was about a kid who decided cruelty was fun as long as the target didn't fight back. That's a values problem, not a shoe problem, and I'd like the school to treat it as one." Gerald had gone very quiet. The practiced ease he'd walked in with entirely drained out of him. Tyler, beside him, was staring at the table like he was trying to make it swallow him whole. "Mrs. Whitfield," Mr. Kowalski said, "I want to assure you this will be handled with the seriousness it deserves. I'll need a few days to complete a full review, given the pattern Coach Reyes has documented. But I can tell you now we're looking at suspension, at minimum, and mandatory counseling before any return to campus." "I'd also ask," Renee said, "whether this is genuinely the first complaint about Tyler's behavior toward other students, or whether it's simply the first one that made it this far." The question landed with unusual precision. Mr. Kowalski's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward Gerald, and something in that half-second glance told everyone in the room that the honest answer wasn't the one anyone wanted to say out loud in that particular meeting. "I'd like that reviewed as well," Mr. Kowalski said carefully. "I'll be pulling prior records." Gerald's face had gone through several colors by now. "Renee, Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know personally, this isn't how our family operates. I'll be having a serious conversation with Tyler tonight." "I believe you're going to have a conversation," Renee said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "I hope it's the right one." She stood, and Marcus stood with her. Ice pack finally set down on the table, and for the first time all week his shoulders had dropped an inch from where they'd been carrying themselves since Tuesday. "Thank you for having us in," Renee said to Mr. Kowalski. "I'd like to be kept informed on next steps." "Of course." At the door, Marcus paused, glancing back, not at Gerald, not really at the room at all, but at Tyler, who was still sitting there, smaller than he'd looked in any gym or cafeteria all week, all the performance drained clean out of him. Marcus didn't say anything. There was nothing to say yet that would mean anything. He just looked at him for a second. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with the plain, tired clarity of someone who'd spent a week absorbing something he'd never asked for. And then he turned and walked out with Renee's hand back on his shoulder. Behind them, in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had 20 minutes earlier, Gerald Briggs sat across from his son and didn't say a word. The story hadn't ended with the phone call. It was only getting started. News in Cedar Falls didn't stay contained to a middle school hallway for long, and by the following Monday, it had traveled well past the group chats of 8th graders. Gerald Briggs had, over the weekend, made the mistake of trying to get ahead of the story himself, a mention to a fellow board member, framed as wanting to be transparent about a misunderstanding involving my son, which had the exact opposite effect of what he intended. By Sunday night, 3 other board members had called Mr. Kowalski directly, and by Monday morning, the district superintendent's office had asked for a full incident file. The regular school board meeting was 2 weeks out, but given the circumstances, an emergency session got called for Thursday evening, technically to review reported concerns regarding student conduct oversight, a phrase bland enough to keep lawyers comfortable, specific enough that everyone in Cedar Falls who cared to look up the agenda online understood exactly what it was actually about. Coach Reyes was asked to attend and present her documentation. She went in with the same folder she'd started keeping notes in weeks earlier, dates, observations, the incident report from the gym, laid out plainly, without embellishment, the way she'd learned worked best when you wanted people to trust what you were telling them. Mr. Kowalski went further than anyone expected. In pulling Tyler's disciplinary history as promised, he'd found 2 prior informal complaints, one from a 6th grade teacher 2 years earlier about comments made toward a classmate's home life, and one from the previous spring, a parent complaint about locker room remarks that had never been formally logged as a disciplinary incident at all. Both had been handled quietly, verbally, without follow-up. Both, it turned out, had crossed Gerald Briggs's desk in some capacity. The first as a courtesy heads-up from a teacher who knew who Tyler's father was. The second dismissed outright, according to the parent's original email, which Mr. Kowalski read into record. The parent had been told, in a phone call from the front office, that boys tease each other. We don't want to escalate this unnecessarily. The board member sitting closest to Gerald, a retired postal worker named Diane Ochoa, who'd sat on that board for 11 years and had a reputation for asking the question nobody else wanted to, leaned into her microphone. "Mr. Briggs, were you aware of either of those prior complaints?" Gerald, who had come to this meeting hoping to speak as a board member rather than as a parent under review, found himself instead answering as exactly the latter. The second one, yes, I was made aware informally. I didn't feel it rose to the level of. Did you disclose that awareness to anyone reviewing the current incident prior to this meeting? Diane asked. I didn't think it was relevant. It's relevant now, she said, not unkindly, just plainly. The way people say true things when they've stopped bothering to soften them. Renee had been invited to speak as well, though she'd initially hesitated. She hadn't wanted this to become a spectacle. Hadn't wanted Marcus's name turned into the centerpiece of a public board fight. But Mr. Kowalski had asked directly, and after a conversation with Marcus that evening, a real conversation, the first long one they'd had since he'd moved in, where he'd finally told her, haltingly, about the tape on his shoe and what it had come to mean to him. She decided there was a version of speaking up that didn't have to be about spectacle at all. She kept it short. I'm not here asking for anyone's head, she said, standing at the small podium set up for public comment. I'm here because a pattern got excused twice before it happened a third time, loud enough that it couldn't be excused anymore. I'd like this board to ask itself honestly whether the reason those first two complaints went nowhere had anything to do with whose name was attached to them. That's the only question I actually came here to raise. She sat back down. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true has just been said in a place built mostly for things that sound true without quite being it. The board didn't reach a final decision that night. These things move through committees and formal votes, not emergency sessions. But the direction was clear enough that everyone in the room understood where it was heading. A motion was made and passed to formally review Gerald Briggs's continued service as vice chair, citing failure to escalate reported student conduct concerns in accordance with district policy. A second motion directed the administration to implement a mandatory logging system for all bullying and harassment complaints, informal or otherwise, closing the exact loophole that had let two prior complaints about Tyler simply evaporate. Gerald left the meeting that night without the easy confidence he'd walked in with 3 weeks earlier. He didn't resign immediately. That would take another 2 weeks. A quiet announcement folded into a district newsletter, citing personal reasons that fooled almost no one in Cedar Falls who'd been paying attention. But the shift had already happened in that room, in front of people who'd known him for years and were now looking at him differently. Marcus wasn't there that night. Renee and Daniel had agreed it wasn't a place for him. Not yet, not while the wound was still this fresh. He was home, at the kitchen table, working through math homework with Daniel sitting across from him, when Renee got back late and set her keys down with the particular quiet of someone who'd spent the evening doing something necessary but exhausting. How'd it go? Marcus asked. It went the way it needed to, Renee said. She didn't elaborate much further that night. Some things she'd let him hear about in pieces, on his own timeline, the same courtesy she was learning to extend to every part of a story. But she sat down next to him at the table, glanced at the math problem he was stuck on, and said, "Want help with this one?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "Yeah, actually." It was the first time all week he'd asked for help with anything at all. Tyler's 2-week suspension started the Monday after the board meeting. Cedar Falls Middle School felt different without him in it. Not quieter exactly. Kids still filled hallways with the same noise they always had, but the specific gravity he'd pulled toward himself in every room was simply gone, and its absence was its own kind of statement. Marcus noticed it mostly in small ways. Nobody made a comment about his shoes that week. Nobody needed to whisper about foothold athletics anymore either. That novelty had already worn its own path through the school and settled into something closer to background fact, the way big news always eventually does. A few kids treated him a little differently, more careful, some of them almost deferential in a way that made him uncomfortable in its own right, like he traded one kind of unwanted attention for another. But mostly, life at Cedar Falls Middle School simply moved forward, and Marcus moved forward with it, still wearing the same taped-up shoes, because he hadn't yet decided he was ready to stop. Tyler's mandatory counseling sessions started that same week, twice weekly, with a district conflict resolution counselor named Mr. Patton, who had exactly the kind of patient, unhurried demeanor that made kids uncomfortable in a different way than punishment did, because there was nowhere to perform for an audience that wasn't there. By the second week, Mr. Patton had asked Tyler to write a letter, not for a grade, not for the record, just an exercise, something Tyler could choose to give to Marcus or not. Tyler wrote 4 drafts. The first three, by his own later admission to Mr. Patton, were mostly about how unfair the last 3 weeks had been for him. It took until the fourth draft for something honest to show up in the margins. He asked to meet Marcus in person to deliver it, rather than send it through a counselor as intermediary. Mr. Kowalski approved a supervised meeting in his office, with Coach Reyes present at Marcus's request, not because Marcus was afraid, but because he wanted a witness who'd actually seen the whole thing unfold, start to finish. Tyler came in wearing regular clothes instead of his usual basketball gear, which felt, oddly, like its own small admission. He didn't sit down right away. "I wrote you something," he said, holding out a folded piece of paper. "You don't have to read it now. Or ever, I guess. I just wanted to say some of it out loud too, if that's okay." Marcus didn't take the paper yet. "Go ahead." Tyler took a breath, the kind of breath that told you he'd rehearsed this, and was still terrified it wouldn't come out right. "I made fun of your shoes because it was easy. That's it. That's the whole reason. It wasn't about the shoes. I didn't even really care about the shoes. You never gave me anything to work with. You never got mad. And it made me feel like I could keep going without accounting for anything. Like you not reacting meant it wasn't landing." He stopped, swallowed. "It was landing. I know that now. My counselors made me sit with that a lot." "You elbowed me," Marcus said. Not an accusation. A fact laid on the table, plainly. The way Renee had taught him things could be said without needing to be shouted. "Yeah." Tyler's voice dropped further. "That wasn't even really about you being annoying for stealing the ball. That was about me hating that the room laughed at me for a second instead of with me. I've been thinking about that a lot too. That I did something that could have actually hurt you because I didn't like 1 second of not being the funniest person in the gym." He looked down. "That's a messed up reason to hurt somebody. I know that." The room was quiet. Coach Reyes, standing near the door, said nothing, letting it play out. "My dad stepping down from a board," Tyler continued, quieter still. "Because of stuff that happened before I even got here, stuff with other kids he brushed off because of who I am. I didn't know about any of that until this week. Finding out kind of messed me up too, honestly. Like I wasn't just some kid being a jerk. I was part of a whole pattern nobody stopped because of who my dad was." Marcus finally reached out and took the folded letter, but he didn't open it yet. He held it, looked at Tyler for a long moment, and said the thing he'd actually been turning over in his head for 3 days, ever since Mr. Kowalski had first mentioned this meeting was being requested. "I hear you," Marcus said, "and I think some of what you just said is real. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's fine or that we're good now, because this wasn't one moment. It was 4 days of it building up, plus whatever happened before I ever got to this school that you're only now finding out about. I can accept that you're sorry. I'm not ready to say I forgive the whole thing, because it wasn't just one thing to forgive. It was a pattern. Patterns take longer than one letter." Tyler nodded slowly, and there was something almost relieved in his face, not because he'd been let off easy, but because Marcus's answer felt honest in a way that a quick, tidy, "It's okay" wouldn't have. "That's fair," Tyler said. "I don't expect you to just forget it. I just wanted you to know I actually get it now, however long that takes to mean something." "Okay," Marcus said. He tucked the letter into his backpack, unopened for now, something he'd read later, on his own time, when it was just his to sit with. "Thanks for saying it to my face, instead of just sending something through Patton." "Yeah." Tyler shifted his weight, unsure what came after this, since nothing in his life so far had really prepared him for a conversation like this one. "I'm serving out the rest of the suspension. I'll be back next week." "Okay," Marcus said again. Not warm. Not cold either. Just even. Coach Reyes finally spoke, quiet from the doorway. "I think that's a good place to end today." Tyler nodded. Gave one last look toward Marcus, not pleading, just something closer to hope, unearned but honestly offered, and left. Marcus sat there a moment longer, backpack in his lap, letter tucked inside it, and let out a breath he hadn't quite realized he'd been holding since Tyler walked in. It wasn't closure. Not yet. But it was, for the first time since that Tuesday lunch 3 weeks ago, something that felt like it was actually moving in the right direction, instead of just being survived. Spring came to Cedar Falls the way it always did, slow at first, then all at once. The kind of turn where one week everyone's still in jackets, and the next the maple trees along Cedar Falls Middle School's front lawn are fully green, and the windows are propped open during last period because the building's ancient air system can't keep up with the first real warm stretch of the year. For months had passed since the board meeting. Gerald Briggs's resignation had gone through quietly in February, replaced on the board by a parent who'd run, in part, on a platform of actually following through on complaints, which told you plenty about how the town had processed what happened without anyone needing to say Tyler's name in the campaign literature. Tyler himself had returned from suspension back in November, subdued for the first few weeks in a way that surprised even the teachers who'd expected some kind of performance out of him. An aggrieved return, a persecuted underdog routine to win his social capital back. It never came. He kept his head down, went to his counseling sessions without complaint, and by December had quietly stopped sitting at the center table in the cafeteria at all, choosing instead a spot near the wall with two other kids who'd never been part of his old orbit. Marcus, for his part, had spent the winter doing what he did best, watching, adjusting, deciding things on his own timeline. Sometime in January, nobody remembered the exact day, which felt right, since Marcus never wanted it to be a moment anyone made a fuss over. He'd started wearing a new pair of shoes. Black and silver low tops with a stitched arrow along the side panel, the same ones half the school already owned. Except these fit in the way shoes are supposed to fit when nobody's making you feel strange about needing them. He still kept the old pair, tape and all, in the back of his closet. He hadn't thrown them away. He wasn't sure he ever would. It was Renee's idea, originally, though she was careful to make sure it never felt like her idea alone. Over a Sunday dinner in February, she'd mentioned casually the way she mentioned most important things, leaving room for Marcus to take it or leave it. That Foothold Athletics ran small community partnership programs in a handful of towns where the company had ties, usually athletic equipment grants, for under-resourced school programs. She asked, almost offhand, whether Marcus thought Cedar Falls Middle School could use something like that. Not because of what happened, she'd clarified quickly, watching his face. I don't want this to be a consolation prize for a bad few weeks. I mean it as its own thing, if you want it. Marcus had thought about it for nearly 2 weeks before answering. When he did, it wasn't quite what Renee expected. He didn't want new gym equipment or sponsored jerseys or anything with the Foothold logo stitched prominently across a banner in the gymnasium. What he wanted, when he finally articulated it one evening at the kitchen table, was smaller and stranger and, Renee thought privately, far better than anything she would have proposed herself. I want it to be about kids not having to hide stuff, Marcus said. Not just shoes. Just anybody who's got something going on nobody sees. A fund kids can use without everybody knowing whose name is on the application. Something quiet. By March, the Foothold Fund at Cedar Falls Middle School existed on paper, a modest but real endowment, administered discreetly through the school counselor's office rather than announced with any assembly or press release, available to any student facing a hidden hardship, whether that meant shoes, winter coats, class trip fees, or the dozen other quiet costs that pile up on families nobody around them realizes are struggling. Applications went through Ms. Alvarez in the nurse's office and the school counselor jointly, names kept confidential even from the front office staff. Nobody at Cedar Falls Middle School, outside a small handful of adults, knew which specific incident had prompted its creation. Marcus had insisted on that part more than almost anything else. Coach Reyes was one of the few who did know the whole story, and by the time the school year wound down toward June, she'd started noticing something she hadn't expected to notice quite so clearly, a shift in how kids talked to each other in her PE classes generally, not just around Marcus. It was subtle. Nothing measurable in the way a district survey could capture it. But there was less of the performative cruelty that had defined Tyler's old orbit, less of kids testing each other for weaknesses to broadcast to an audience, more of the ordinary, unremarkable kindness that a good middle school gym class is supposed to run on without anyone commenting on its absence or presence either way. She mentioned it almost by accident to Mr. Kowalski during a hallway conversation in late May, the two of them watching a stretch of 8th graders filing toward the buses at the end of the day. I've been teaching here 11 years, she said. I know it sounds like I'm reading into one good semester, but something actually changed this year. Not because of one policy or one program, Just, the room feels different than it used to. Kids look out for each other more than they used to look for an angle on each other. You think it's the fund? Mr. Kowalski asked. I think it's a dozen small things, Coach Reyes said. The fund's one of them. The reporting changes are another. But honestly, I think a lot of it traces back to one kid who never once raised his voice through any of it, and everybody watching that happened learned something from it, whether they could put words to it or not. She hadn't meant for Marcus to overhear that he was 30 feet away, gathering his things from the bleachers where his last class of the day had wrapped. But the gym had good acoustics for a room that age, and he caught enough of it to feel something warm and slightly embarrassing settle in his chest, the kind of feeling he still wasn't entirely used to letting himself have in that building. He didn't say anything about it to Coach Reyes directly. But that evening, at dinner, when Daniel asked how his day had gone, Marcus told them, haltingly, still working out how to talk about himself out loud without immediately deflecting the way he used to, what he'd overheard in the gym. She really said that? Renee asked, setting her fork down. Yeah. Marcus pushed a piece of chicken around his plate, working up to the rest of it. I don't know if it's true. That it changed the whole room. I mean, feels like a lot to put on one thing. Maybe it's not one thing, Daniel said. Maybe it's what happens when one kid refuses to give people the reaction they're fishing for, long enough that eventually the whole room forgets that reaction was ever the point. Marcus thought about that for a while, chewing slowly, the way he did when something was actually landing instead of just passing through. I still have the old shoes, he said finally, apropos of nothing, though everyone at the table understood exactly what he meant by it. In my closet. I don't wear them, but I'm not getting rid of them. You don't have to, Renee said simply. They're yours. Whatever they mean to you now, that's yours to decide too. Marcus nodded and went back to his dinner, and outside the kitchen window the maple trees along the edge of the Whitfield property had gone fully green for the season, the same way they had at Cedar Falls Middle School's front lawn, the same way they probably had every June for as long as anyone in that town could remember. Except that this particular June, something in the building 3 miles away had actually shifted, quietly, the way real change tends to, without anyone needing to announce it happened at all. The last week of school always had a strange, suspended quality to it. Teachers half checked out. Kids restless in a building that suddenly felt too small for the season. Everyone counting down toward a summer that hadn't quite started yet, but had already claimed most people's attention. Cedar Falls Middle School's final assembly was scheduled for the Thursday before the last day, the traditional wrap-up of awards, yearbook signing, and the particular chaos of 213-year-olds trying to squeeze a year's worth of unspoken feelings into 48 hours. Marcus hadn't planned on being part of anything at that assembly. He'd never been the kind of student who got called up for awards, not because he didn't deserve them, but because the awards Cedar Falls handed out tended to go to the loud accomplishments, the tournament wins, and the student council titles. And Marcus had spent the year building something quieter than any of that, which was exactly why it caught him off guard when Mr. Kowalski, going through the final program near the end of the assembly, called his name for something the program simply listed as a community impact recognition, vague enough, by design, that it wouldn't draw a direct line back to anything he hadn't wanted publicized. Renee and Daniel had known it was coming. Marcus hadn't, not exactly, though some part of him had suspected something was in the works when Mr. Kowalski had asked, weeks earlier, whether it would be all right to acknowledge the Foothold Fund publicly without naming who'd inspired it. He walked up in front of the whole grade, feeling the particular vertigo of standing where he'd spent an entire year deliberately not standing, and Mr. Kowalski kept his remarks short and, mercifully, free of specifics. This year, a new resource became available to students at this school, Mr. Kowalski said, one that's already helped several of your classmates with things they might otherwise have had to carry alone. It exists because one student cared enough about other kids' dignity to ask for something that wouldn't have a single thing to do with his own name being attached to it. I won't share details. That's the whole point of how it works. But I did want to take a moment before the year ends to say thank you, Marcus, for thinking about people beyond yourself. The applause that followed wasn't the loud, whooping kind that greeted the basketball trophy or the student council announcements. It was steadier than that, sustained, The sound of 200 kids who mostly understood, in the vague way middle schoolers understand most things, that something real had happened this year that they'd only seen the edges of. Marcus didn't say anything into the microphone. He hadn't prepared anything, hadn't wanted to, and Mr. Kowalski hadn't pushed him to. He just gave a small nod, the same economical gesture he gave to most things, and walked back to his seat, where Coach Reyes, sitting near the back with the rest of the PE staff, caught his eye and gave him the smallest possible nod back. Not a big reaction, just an acknowledgement between two people who'd watched the whole thing unfold from very different vantage points, and arrived at the same understanding of what it had meant. Tyler was in the audience too, several rows back, clapping along with everyone else. He'd spent the spring in a strange, quiet orbit around his old life, not fully rehabilitated in the way after-school specials like to wrap things up, not performing contrition either, just genuinely, slowly becoming a slightly different version of who he'd been in September. He'd made the JV baseball team in April, which gave him somewhere to put the competitive energy that used to leak out sideways into cruelty. He still hadn't fully earned back the goodwill of every kid he'd targeted over the years. Some things take longer than a school year to repair, and Marcus had been right about that from the beginning. But he wasn't performing for a crowd anymore either, and that, on its own, had rearranged the social chemistry of the whole 8th grade in ways nobody could have predicted back in September. After the assembly, in the chaos of the hallway, as everyone filtered out toward buses and pickup lines, Devin, the same kid who'd first put the pieces together back in October, connecting Renee's name to the Foothold logo on her shoes, caught up to Marcus near his locker. "Hey," Devin said, a little awkward, the way kids get when they're about to say something slightly more sincere than their usual register allows. "That thing they just did up there. That was cool, man. For real." "Thanks," Marcus said. "Also," Devin added, glancing down, unable to help himself, "those the new Foothold low tops? The ones that dropped in March." Marcus looked down at his own shoes, black and silver, the arrow stitched clean along the side. The same pair he'd started wearing back in January without any fanfare, without telling anyone at school where they'd come from, without needing anyone to notice them at all anymore. "Yeah, they're clean," Devin said, with the specific reverence of a true sneakerhead. Then, almost as an afterthought, glancing at Marcus's locker, half open, where an old gray shoebox sat pushed toward the back corner, visible if you were looking, which Devin clearly was. "Wait, are those the old ones? The taped-up ones?" Marcus closed his locker a little, not defensively, just naturally. "Yeah, I keep them." Devin didn't ask why, which Marcus appreciated more than he could easily explain. Some kids, over the course of that year, had learned when a question needed asking and when it didn't. "That's kind of a flex, honestly," Devin said instead, grinning, "keeping the OGs around after everything." Marcus almost laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind that had gotten rarer for him to give away over a hard year, but hadn't disappeared. "It's not a flex. I just don't feel like throwing them away." "Sure, man. Whatever you say." Devin clapped him once on the shoulder, easy, the gesture of a kid who'd clearly decided, sometime over the winter, that Marcus Webb was simply someone worth being friendly with, no ulterior motive attached anymore. "See you next year." "See you." That evening, at home, Marcus sat on the floor of his room, going through the shoebox he'd carried up from his locker one last time before summer, not to get rid of anything, just to look. The gray mesh had faded further over the winter, sitting mostly unworn in the back of his closet since January. The black tape along the seam gone slightly brittle with age, but still holding, the way it always had. Renee knocked lightly on his open door, leaning against a frame rather than coming all the way in, a habit she'd built over the year, giving him room without making him ask for it. "You okay in here?" "Yeah." Marcus held the shoe up slightly, turning it over in his hands. "Just looking at these." She came and sat on the edge of his bed, not pushing, just present. "You've had a lot happen since you first showed up wearing those." "Yeah." He set the shoe down carefully, the way he'd always handled it, not out of sentiment exactly, or not only that, but out of the same instinct that had made him tape the seam so neatly in the first place, a long time before he'd ever met the Whitfields. "I used to think keeping them was about not letting anybody talk me out of the one thing that was actually mine. Like if I let go of the shoes, I was letting go of everything before this. Before you guys, I mean. Before any of it. And now," Marcus considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things these days, slower than most 13-year-olds bother to. But that had always been part of who he was, not something the year had forced into him. Now, I think I just like having something that reminds me I got through it without needing to be somebody different to survive it. I didn't have to yell or fight back or prove anything. I just had to keep being who I already was, long enough for everybody else to catch up to seeing it. Renee didn't say anything for a moment. Just let that sit in the room, the way she'd learned to let his best thoughts sit, without rushing past them. That's a pretty good thing to know about yourself at 13, she said finally. Yeah. Marcus closed the shoebox lid, gently, and slid it back onto the shelf in his closet, not hidden, not displayed either, just kept exactly where it belonged. I think so too. 3 years is long enough for a town to half forget the specifics of something and remember only its shape. The way Cedar Falls, by the time Marcus was a junior in high school, mostly recalled the story of that kid and the shoes, as a kind of local folklore rather than a sequence of actual Tuesday afternoons that had once felt unbearable to live through. Tyler Briggs had graduated middle school, moved on to Cedar Falls High a year ahead of Marcus, and settled into a version of himself that bore only a passing resemblance to the boy who'd once needed an audience for every joke he made. He'd stayed on the baseball team, made some genuine friends outside his old orbit, and by all accounts had become the kind of upperclassman who actually intervened when he saw something ugly starting in a hallway rather than the kind who started it. He and Marcus weren't close. Exactly. Some distances just settle into place and stay there permanently without needing repair, but they were civil, and once, in the parking lot after a football game, Tyler had nodded at him in a way that felt less like performance and more like genuine, quiet acknowledgement of two people who'd both changed since the version of themselves that first met in a cafeteria years earlier. The Foothold Fund at Cedar Falls Middle School had grown, modestly but steadily, still administered with the same quiet confidentiality Marcus had insisted on from the start. What nobody in Cedar Falls quite expected was how far the idea would travel beyond their own town. It started small, a conversation Renee had at an industry conference in Chicago, where another founder, running a mid-size athletic apparel company out of Minneapolis, asked her about the program almost in passing after hearing a brief mention of it during a panel on corporate community partnerships. Renee hadn't planned to make it a pitch. She'd simply described it the way Marcus had first described it to her at their kitchen table. A fund kids could use without anyone knowing whose name was on the application, built around the idea that dignity shouldn't require a public accounting of what you'd lost to keep it. The Minneapolis company started its own version within the year. Then a school district outside Atlanta adapted the model independently after a local news piece. One of the few times the Cedar Falls story ever made it past word of mouth into an actual article, though even then, at Marcus's request, his name was kept out of it. The piece focusing instead on an anonymous Ohio program that other districts might consider replicating. By the time Marcus was finishing his sophomore year of high school, similar quiet dignity funds existed in some form in at least 6 school districts across 4 states, none of them publicly tracing back to a single cafeteria confrontation in Cedar Falls, Ohio, which was, if you asked Marcus, exactly how it should stay. He didn't think about the ripple of it often. Most days it was just part of the ordinary architecture of his life, a program that existed, quietly doing what it was built to do. The same way the black and silver shoes on his feet had stopped being a statement of any kind years earlier and become simply what he wore, because he liked them, because they fit, because nobody was watching to see whether he'd earned the right to wear them. But there was one afternoon, the spring of his sophomore year, when the shape of it came back to him more directly than usual. He'd gone with Renee to a Foothold Athletics community event in Cleveland, nothing to do with Cedar Falls specifically, just one of the company's ordinary outreach programs, providing gear to an underfunded rec league on the city's east side. Marcus mostly stood at the edges of these things when Renee brought him along, comfortable now in a way he hadn't been 3 years earlier, but still preferring to watch more than to be watched. A boy at the event, maybe 11, quiet in a way Marcus recognized instantly. The specific stillness of someone who'd learned that quiet kept things from getting worse, had hung back near the equipment table long after the other kids had grabbed their gear and run off to the courts. Marcus noticed him the way Coach Reyes used to notice things, not because the kid did anything dramatic, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't reach for the new shoes on the table with the others. He kept glancing at his own, old, a size too small, the toe box starting to separate. Marcus walked over, not making a thing of it, and crouched down near the table like he was just organizing the boxes. "You want a pair?" The boy shrugged, non-committal, the universal gesture of a kid protecting himself from wanting something too visibly. "I got shoes." "Yeah," Marcus said. "I kept an old pair of mine for like 3 years after I didn't need to anymore. Wasn't about needing them." He picked up a box in roughly the boy's size, set it down near him. Didn't push it any further than that. No pressure. They're just sitting here either way. The boy looked at him for a second, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then, slowly, reached for the box. "Thanks," he said, quiet, and that was the whole conversation. No dramatic reveal, no speech, nothing that would ever make it into a story anyone told later. Just one kid recognizing another, across a gap of years and cities, in the particular language of people who understood exactly what it cost to need something and not want to ask for it. Marcus thought about that exchange the whole drive home, Renee at the wheel, the Cleveland skyline shrinking in the side mirror behind them. "You good?" Renee asked, glancing over at a red light. "Yeah." Marcus watched the road ahead, turning something over the way he always did, slowly, thoroughly, giving it the time it deserved before saying it out loud. Just thinking about that kid, the one with the old shoes. What about him? Marcus was quiet for a moment longer, then said the thing that had been forming in him the whole drive, the closest thing to a philosophy he'd built out of everything that had happened since that first Tuesday lunch 3 years earlier. "I used to think the whole point of what happened to me was that eventually people found out who I really was, and that's what fixed things," he said. "But I don't think that's actually it. I think the point was that I didn't need anybody to find out anything, for me to already be worth treating right. The finding out part was just what happened to change how Cedar Falls saw it. It didn't change what was already true." Renee didn't answer right away, letting the words settle the way she'd learned to over the years. The same patience she'd shown him at 13 still intact now that he was old enough to say things like that without needing her to fix them. "That's a good thing to know," she said finally, echoing, without either of them quite realizing it, the exact words she'd said to him 3 years earlier in his bedroom doorway. "At any age." "Yeah," Marcus said, watching the last of the Cleveland skyline disappear behind them, the highway opening up toward home. "I think so too." Somewhere behind them, in a rec center on Cleveland's east side, a boy was lacing up a new pair of shoes for the first time, not yet knowing the small, quiet chain of Tuesdays and phone calls and taped-up sneakers that had put them in his hands. He didn't need to know it. That was the whole point. Some things get to just be kindness, plain and unexplained, passed forward without anyone needing to trace it back to where it started. There's a particular kind of story that keeps circulating because it tells us something we want to believe about the world, that quiet decency eventually gets seen, that cruelty eventually meets a mirror it can't argue with, that the kid nobody bothered to really look at might be carrying more than anyone imagined. Marcus Webb's story has all of that in it. But if you strip away the drama of the reveal, the phone call, the badge, the moment a hallway full of 8th graders rearranged everything they thought they knew about a boy in taped-up shoes, what's actually left underneath is something much simpler and much harder to manufacture on purpose. Marcus never needed anyone to find out who his foster parents were. That part of the story is almost incidental, even though it's the part that made the room go quiet. What actually mattered, what should have mattered all along, regardless of what came out in that principal's office, was that a new kid showed up to a school that didn't know him yet, and some of the people there decided his worth was negotiable based on the state of his sneakers. That would have been true whether or not Renee Whitfield ever walked through those front doors. The reveal didn't create the injustice. It just made it impossible to keep looking away from. That's worth sitting with, because it's easy to walk away from a story like this thinking the moral is about waiting for a dramatic unveiling to fix what's broken, that somewhere out there is a badge, a title, a hidden fortune that will eventually vindicate every quiet kid who's ever been underestimated. Most of the time, that's not how it goes. Most quiet kids never get a phone call that changes the whole room. Most bullies never sit through a board meeting that costs their father his seat. The dignity Marcus was owed from the very first day of school wasn't something he earned by turning out to be connected to a sneaker empire. It was something he was owed simply by walking through those doors as a kid trying to find his footing in a new home. The story just happened to give us a circumstance dramatic enough to make that truth visible to everyone at once. What Cedar Falls actually got right, in the end, wasn't the reveal itself. It was what came after. Coach Reyes kept a quiet log before anyone asked her to, because she'd learned that patterns don't announce themselves loudly enough on their own. Mr. Kowalski didn't bury the prior complaints once he found them, even though burying them would have been easier and would have protected people with more institutional power than a 13-year-old foster kid. The board didn't just discipline one student. They closed the loophole that had let 2 earlier warnings evaporate into nothing. And Marcus, given the chance to make his story about vindication, chose instead to make it about a fund that would let other kids keep their dignity intact without anyone ever needing to find out their name. That's the real reversal, if you look closely. Not rich versus poor, not powerful versus powerless. It's a reversal of a system that had for years let complaints about a well-connected kid simply dissolve into one that finally decided a pattern mattered more than a last name. It's the reversal of a boy who'd learned that silence was the safest way to survive 4 foster placements, into someone who slowly discovered he could speak plainly, ask for help, and still be exactly as safe as he needed to be. Tyler's arc matters too, and it's worth resisting the urge to flatten him into a cartoon. He wasn't a monster. He was a kid who'd absorbed, without ever being told to examine it, the idea that other people's hardship was material for his own entertainment, and who'd never once been stopped early enough to learn otherwise. His father's failure wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the quieter, more common failure of protecting comfort over accountability again and again, until the bill finally came due all at once. Neither of them were beyond repair. But repair in this story was never treated as automatic or owed. Marcus made that clear the day Tyler handed him that letter. An apology can be real and still not be enough, on its own, to erase a pattern. Some things take longer than a single conversation to actually mean something, and Marcus never pretended otherwise, not even to make the moment easier for Tyler, or for himself. If there's a single thread worth carrying out of Cedar Falls, it's probably this. Composure isn't the same as passivity, and quiet isn't the same as weak. Marcus never raised his voice through any of it, and that restraint wasn't him swallowing what happened. It was him refusing to hand anyone the reaction they were fishing for, until the truth had room to surface on its own terms instead of his. That's a harder, slower kind of strength than the kind we usually put in headlines. It doesn't look like much in the moment. It just looks like a kid, quietly wearing his own shoes, waiting for the world to catch up to what was true about him the entire time. Thank you so much for spending this story with us tonight. If it meant something to you, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need them. And stick around, because we've got 2 more hand-picked stories coming up next that I think you're going to want to see all the way through. See you in the next one.